Here we go.
Okay.
My name is Lawrence Rosenberg, and this is the Alpha Human Podcast. Our guest today is Michael Walsh. Michael is a renowned author of more than 15 books. He was the classical music critic for Time magazine and received the 2004 American Book Award for fiction for his gangster novel, And All the Saints. His books, The Devil's Pleasure Palace and The Fiery Angel, examine the enemies, heroes, triumphs, and struggles of Western civilization from the ancient past to the present time. His latest book, which we're going to get into today, is Last Stands: Why Men Fight When All Is Lost, which delves into the masculine attributes of heroism that forged American civilization and Western culture by exploring historical battles in which soldiers chose death over dishonor. Michael, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you, Lawrence.
So, your book, Last Stands, is so impactful, not just for the battles, the last stand conflicts that have dotted our history, but it is a look into where we are currently as a civilization with respect to maybe even our decline and what we have given up with respect to our birthright. And when I say our birthright, our ability as humans, as men, for that matter, mankind, and our nature, which is to compete and to forge ahead no matter what the price is, and to face off against one another whenever necessary to progress. And the way you lay out, again, not just the really powerful battles that are described in the book, but the ideas and the concepts around the differences between today and what was throughout history is stark. It's riveting. It's frightening. But there's a bit of fire and passion and motivation in there, because what you lay out is within our reach. It's within our grasp to grab once again. And so I really want to dig into what you talk about in Last Stands.
Well, thank you very much for those kind words. I've been tremendously pleased, obviously, but surprised a bit by the success this book has had so quickly. We sold out on day one of publication. It was published on December 1st, 2020, and by that evening, they were all gone from Amazon. And it took us a good month to get another 20, 30,000 copies back into circulation and available for the reader. So we had a great opening, and then we had a little bit of a pause while we caught up with the demand. And I should break a little news right now, because you're the first person that is going to be able to broadcast this, but I have just agreed to write a sequel to Last Stands for my terrific publisher, Macmillan St. Martin's Press. And it will be a sequel more in spirit than in actual kind, but it will go back into some of these issues and open up the lens of the camera maybe a little wider to take a look at the historical impact of battles that weren't just last stands, but were actually pivotal, history-changing battles. So that book, we hope we'll have it out by the late spring of 2023.
That sounds exciting, and I could envision why such a book would be in high demand. I can't wait for that one. I've already read Last Stands, and it's the kind of book that you're going to read again and again. So we'll all have to make do with that for now. But I'm not too surprised by its success. So let's kind of dig into Last Stands. And so I'm going to quote you throughout the interview because there's a lot of great ideas and points that you bring up here, and we could really dig into your thoughts and your philosophy on a lot of these concepts. But you opened the book, Michael, by talking about your father
Mm,
and his baptism by fire during the Korean War. I'm going to
yeah.
quote you here. Assigned to a weapons company in the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, aka the 2-5, the most decorated company in Marine Corps history, my father went ashore at Pusan in the midst of chaos. Who's in command here? He asked the first Marine he saw. You are, sir, came the reply. In 100-degree heat and with artillery incoming, he jumped into a shell crater on the Obang Ni Ridge and found himself sharing the space with a dead North Korean. Welcome to war in Korea. My father, already a man at the age of 24, immediately took command and has never relinquished it, as no real man ever does, at least not willingly, and except by death. So, Michael, with that, tell us about your dad, who he was as a man, and how it informed the central thesis and spirit of this book.
Well, he still is. He will be 95 years old on June
Wow.
1st. Uh, he was born on the same day as Marilyn Monroe, and I just find that to be a very piquant and interesting historical coincidence.
Interesting.
Uh, he had, as you mentioned, his baptism by fire as a 24-year-old first lieutenant in the USMC. He fought not only in Pusan, but landed at Incheon, which was MacArthur's very daring uh, attack from the rear, in a way, going all the way around the Korean Peninsula and launching an amphibious assault. He fought the Battle of Seoul, which was the most brutal. There were a series of battles of Seoul, the most brutal battles in the Korean War. And he was at the Chosin Reservoir in the fall of 1950, which battle is now legendary in Marine Corps history. If the 2-5 was the already most decorated unit in the Marines, they sure as heck were after the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir.
Mm.
He stayed in the Marines for 20 years. He worked in the Navy Department for another 20, and he retired and moved with my mother down to Florida. And she passed away a couple of years ago, but he's still there and doing what retired Marines do, reading voraciously and working in his garden. So God bless him.
Well, absolutely. And, um, you know, that that spirit that lives on today in your dad, um, you could see its impact within the canon of what you have written. How did he and his experiences, how did that impact
Hmm.
your thoughts uh, with respect to Last Stands and the ideas central to the book itself?
That's a great question, Lawrence. We took quite different paths in life. I uh, was, I think the term today is a gifted child. I went through school very, very quickly, uh, and had to deal with always, being the youngest kid in my class, or way ahead of my various classes. And I won a National Merit Scholarship, 4-year scholarship to college, which is basically a entree to any college in the country
Mm.
at that point. But I went to the Eastman School of Music in Rochester, New York, partly because I'm a pianist. I'm interested in music, and I was arrogant enough at 17 to think that I was already a pretty good writer. So what the hell could they possibly teach me about that? I learned the hard way that I wasn't. But that he found that very strange, because I'm the oldest child and the first son, and normally I would have gone into the service the way he did.
Right.
Uh, I chose a different path, although I wound up in much the same place years later, when I spent 6 years on and off going between East Berlin and Moscow during the end of the Cold War. So I had a front row seat for that. I speak fluent German, so I was able to move around the country quite easily. I like to tell people I was in Berlin when the wall came down, and I was in Russia when Chernobyl blew up, which is true.
Wow.
And I think what he imparted to me, even though we took these very different paths, was don't be afraid of anything. For God's sakes, what's the worst it can do? Kill you? I mean, so what? Uh, his philosophy is we all got to go sometime. I say that's easy for you to say. Your life expectancy was at 24 was about 30 seconds, and now you're 95. So you seem to have beaten the odds on that pretty well.
Mm,
But you know, there were times in East Berlin when it was spooky, and God knows when you were dealing with the Soviets in Moscow, that was always an adventure. But I just feel like I can do whatever uh, talents God has given me to do the best I can with them, and not worry about failure and not worry about being intimidated. I think when you grow up and your father is a Marine Corps combat veteran, there's really not too many people you're afraid of.
right. Yeah, that I could imagine. Okay, let's quote you again here in the book.
Mhm.
Um, so the state of peace among men living side by side is not the natural state. The natural state is one of war, wrote Immanuel Kant in Perpetual Peace, a philosophical sketch. This does not always mean open hostilities, but at least an unceasing threat of war. Indeed, war is the natural state of man, and the history of the world is written in blood. In Leviathan, the philosopher Thomas Hobbes evoked the biblical Ishmael when he spoke of the war of every man against every man. And a glance at Genesis 16:12 provides the archetype. Quote, and he will be a wild man. His hand will be against every man, and every man's hand against him, and he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren. To observe that war is crucial to civilizational advancement is also to observe the following: that human beings have a larger purpose than simply living out their 70. So, Michael, what is that larger purpose? And how does war advance our destiny?
Well, I think to introduce a new element into this is important, which is the role of women in our society.
Mm-hmm.
I think that much of this book, the offstage character is the women in the lives of these men. I make it explicit at the end of the book where my father credits two women in his life that kept him safe throughout the combat years in Korea and later Vietnam. He also went to Nam, and that was the
Mm-hmm.
Blessed Virgin Mary. He's a devout Irish Catholic, and his wife. Uh, and that tells you in part what he was fighting for. I think that men are aggressive. Men are all the things women say we are. We're toxic. We're stupid. We're dirty. We're we throw our clothes on the floor. We do a lot of things that annoy women, and it's time for men to kind of embrace that, in my opinion, and tell the women, too bad. Who
Mm.
cares? And leave me alone. These are three very important rules, I think, for young men to learn. That we move civilization forward by argument. It's in a way, I'm a screenwriter and a novelist too, and that's the key to drama. One of the first things I learned when I went to Hollywood was, as my rabbi Daniel, the late great Daniel Melnick, said to me, conflict in every scene. Conflict in every scene. That
Mm.
no scene in a movie should not have some element where people are bumping up against each other. And that's a very masculine thing. It's been demonized now as toxic masculinity, but as I like to say to my female friends and relatives, you better hope we're toxic when the time comes, because that's the only thing standing between you and the bad guys. And you like to quote Aaron Sorkin, who's a liberal, obviously,
Hmm.
his play A Few Good Men, where Colonel Jessup steals the show by insulting Tom Cruise, and saying, "You want us on that wall? You need us on that wall." And he speaks to him very contemptuously. Son, you got to, this kind of thing. Who's going to do it? You, Lieutenant Weinberg? He spits out, just as evil a man as he can possibly be, and yet the audience is totally rooting for that guy, totally rooting for him. And
Yes.
that's apparently surprised the author. And that happens time and again in some movies where the guy thinks, they're going to hate him now for doing X, and then the audience cheers. So men have been demonized, to use a current term, but so what? We're in conflict right now with the Chinese. We're in conflict with the Russians. We have been for quite a while. We're in conflict with, all of our neighbors. Canada now has become effectively a fascist country and extremely restrictive. If you saw the video of the cops breaking into the Christian church and
Yes.
pastor throwing him out, and
Yes.
everybody cheered when that happened. Even in my own adopted and homeland country of Ireland, we've had the Gardaí, we call them the guards, going into churches and arresting people for attending mass. Now, when you can get arrested for attending mass in Ireland, something is really, really wrong. And the men have not stood up. This is a pet peeve of mine with this COVID panic, but the men have not stood up. We've ceded the field to the Karens of the world, and we wear masks and we hunker down and we are obedient. No real man is obedient, for God's sakes. I mean, unless you're in the service and you understand hierarchy and rank. There's a wonderful line in the movie The Last of the Mohicans, where the Brit says to the American, "You call yourself a citizen of a subject of the king," and he says, "I don't call myself subject to much of anything at all." And that's the way, especially American men, used to be. And I think we've been cowed and pushed around and shouted at, and all of our best traits have been weaponized against us. And so in part, Last Dance is literally a celebration of toxic masculinity. And I think the women had just better get over it, because a lot more of it is coming their way. If the success of this book is any indication, and we believe it is, there's a huge, huge hunger for among men, and young men especially, to be told it's okay to be you. Listen, you can't act on every appetite you have. You can't just bonk the girl over her head, drag her into a bush caveman style. That's
Right. Right.
obviously not what we're advocating here. But we are advocating stand up and fight for what you believe in and fight for what's yours and don't back down. That's how civilization progresses, as my uh, uh, idol, and I mean that, Camille Paglia said in Sexual Personae, if civilization were left in the hands of women, we'd all be living in grass huts. And what she meant by that was women are collegial, they're committees, everything must be a consensus, despite all the backstabbing and machinations that goes on. But they're going to stay on one side of the river and never figure out how to get to the other side of the river. And the guy's going to say, "Hey, Jesus, we ought to like build a bridge or something and go over there because it's nicer." And then everybody then get together, build a bridge, and over they go. So when you look at the Romans, for example,
Mhm.
I'll just conclude this thought with this one. The Romans were dominant militarily, not only because the legions were vicious and extremely well disciplined and fought like crazy people, but because the Romans were great builders. They never met anything they couldn't build around. They would throw up a camp overnight. They would build pontoon bridges and cross the great rivers of Europe. They were the greatest examples of sort of the Royal Engineers. The British modeled part of their army on the Roman army, that they were prepared to overcome any physical obstacle in their way in order to get what they wanted. They built walls around cities almost overnight, as Caesar did at Alesia, to corral the Gauls and end the war against Vercingetorix. It's amazing. So men are just more active, and that's not to say that women should be like men. I think we're complementary sexes, and we work best when we're complementary. But a man won't sit back and a real man won't sit back and let his civilization, his home, his family be destroyed. No, it's time to say enough of that.
Mm, mm. So, okay, I think that nicely dovetails into this next um, point that I would love to get your insight on. So, to quote you, to observe that war is crucial to civilizational advancement is also to observe the following: that human beings have a larger purpose than simply living out their three score and ten, that men are born to father children and defend them and their women against other men who would kill them or otherwise take advantage of them. That the measure of a real man is not how much money he makes, although that is one metric to use current jargon, but what he has done in his life, how far he has sailed, how well he has loved, how he has raised his children, and how much or little they love him. what he has contributed to the historical record, what he has left in the way of posterity and for posterity, his mark, whether it be empire or a simple X. So, Michael, must we engage in war to sail far, to love well, to raise children that love and admire them, and to contribute to the historical record? And what then for those of us that are not the product of war? Are we merely living off the largesse and the dividend of those who have risked their lives in war before us?
That's a great question too, Lawrence. I think, in a way, the Islam has this right about jihad, that there's many different interpretations of jihad, but one that is quite common is your internal struggle. So that men have to struggle against. Well, there's lots of things we struggle. Our clothes on the floor, our indolence. I'd rather stay home and drink beer and watch TV, or just the kinds of things that distract us from our task. And maybe this is my Irish Catholic upbringing, but I believe we all have some task to do here in life. We have talents, and luckily everyone has different talents, and we work together as communities in order to build our communities, tell them stories, build bridges, send guys to the moon. Uh, and that's really our struggle. Now, when it comes down to where the rubber meets the road, do we fight? And Americans used to fight very well, but we haven't fought a war that we've won since 1945. That's a long time. That's almost 80 years now. And what have we got to show for it? We've been going backwards in the world. It doesn't mean, this is a crucial distinction. It doesn't mean to be belligerent. It doesn't mean to go around being a bully and smacking people
Mhm.
and taking their stuff and grabbing their women and whatever other things bullies and invaders do. But it means pushing ahead, not being afraid. I think fear is the most important thing. I think women are by nature physiologically more fearful than men, because men are bigger than they are and stronger than they are, no matter what the feminists would have us believe. Uh, and so they're naturally more defensive and more protective, and someone has to protect them, and that job has fallen to us. But we have to protect ourselves. We have to protect what it means to be a man, what we believe to be true. And if they don't like it, well, too bad. I mean, we don't want it to come to shooting, but at
Mhm.
some point in the life of every nation in the world, it comes to shooting. And then, as I like to ask in my weekly Epic Times column, what are you going to do about it? What are you prepared to do? I quote movies a lot. It's the great line from David Mamet's screenplay to The Untouchables, where Kevin Costner and Sean Connery are in church, and they're having a quiet conversation, and Connery, who's playing Elliot Ness, says, he wants to get Capone, and Connery, who's playing an Irish beat cop, says, "What are you prepared to do?" And he's asked, "What are you prepared to do?" And Connery says, "Anything he says, "Not within the law. What are you prepared to do
Right.
to get Capone?" And that's a question every man has to ask himself.
So, I guess it, is prospering then under the threat? Because you said fear is very important, and it doesn't necessarily mean we all have to go to war. So is prospering under the threat of war? Say, I mean, clearly there was a lot of progress during the Cold War, right? We didn't enter into a hot war, although there were a lot of proxies going on, a lot of proxy battles around the world during that time. But is prospering under the threat of war and the endless competition for domination and supremacy, be it scientific or technological, or even the battle of ideas, right? The ideological battle. Is that type of fight, is that enough for us as humans in order to progress? Or are we never to reach that pinnacle unless we as a civilization experience some of the types of battles you lay out as pivotal, or as last stands that meant a lot to the advancement of civilizations across time.
Yeah, well, suffering is a great way of learning things, isn't it? And every kid needs to be disciplined. Every recruit needs to go to Paris Island, and uh, every student in a college class, although this is obviously no longer true, needs to be busted back down to Buck Private because he really doesn't know anything. And
Right.
so Buck Private is a good place for, especially for men, to go to, where you are the lowest belly crawling maggot in this man's army, however the drill sergeant wants to rag on you. I think we have to get ourselves together again on this thing. We don't There will be war. We have not seen the last of war. That's one thing history teaches us. From the Kubrick Dawn of Man segment of 2001, where the one ape finds a jawbone and starts bashing the other ape over the head. Well, that ape's tribe just won that fight, right? So
Mm.
every civilization progresses by some combat. Nothing is new here, Lawrence. Nothing is new. Caesar went up to fight in part because the Swiss, the Helvetians, had decided they didn't like living in a frozen rock at the top of the Alps. And they
Right.
thought that Bordeaux seemed like a lot nicer place for them to be. So they all decided to migrate to what's now southern France. Uh, and the Gauls, who are Celts, like the Irish are, didn't like that particularly, and so they called on their friends in Rome to stop it. And Caesar went up and said to the Helvetians, "Stop," and they didn't. So he killed them all. And then he drove the others back to Switzerland, and that was the end of that. Otherwise, the ethnic mix of Europe would have been different. Now, sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. The Germans stopped the Roman advance at the Battle of the Teutoburg Pass, the Teutoburg Forest. And so Germany developed very differently, linguistically, legally, culturally, every other way than the Latinized parts of Western Europe, i.e., Spain and France. Uh, these We bump up against each other. The late Samuel Huntington referred to Islam's bloody borders. Wherever Islam borders a state that's non-Islamic, there will be trouble. The West has known that since the 7th century during the great years of the Arab conquest, when they came sweeping out and they removed the Roman colonies in North Africa. What else did they do? They conquered much of Syria, which is another Roman colony, Judea, which was a Roman colony at the time. They pushed their way into Central Europe. They Islamicized Bulgaria and Albania, certainly, and got all the way to the gates of Vienna by the time the 16th century rolled, or 17th century rolled around. And
Mm.
then they were pushed back. But we're still fighting the bloody borders war with Islam on a lot of fronts. Sometimes the war is hot, sometimes it's cold. Same with the Soviet Union. Most of it was a Cold War, but it still wasn't pretty. And uh, if you spent any time in the communist countries, as I did at the end, you could see what an ugly and awful society that was, and how the end of it was now beginning to be visible even before it collapsed. I remember I went in 1986 with the great pianist Vladimir Horowitz because I was writing for Time magazine at that time, and we were doing a cover story on the greatest pianist of his era and the first trip back to his Russian birthplace. But the KGB wasn't happy about it. We had just bombed Libya in Gaddafi. They harassed us a lot. They broke into the ambassador's residence and or one of their agents inside the house, cut the strings on the piano so Horowitz couldn't practice.
Mm.
When you drove, as I did, all over Eastern Europe, it was this sewer of environmental damage, poisoned lakes, horrible sort of almost ghetto-like apartment buildings that were falling down even as they were going up. And it was so striking, the difference between our society this was under Reagan, of course, but America in general, and what you were seeing. Uh, that you, I came back and I went on Lynn Samuel's radio show in New York City, I think in '86, probably '86, right after we got back, and I said, "This isn't a first world country; it's a third world country with nuclear weapons that may or may not work." We had so elevated the Russians to 12 feet tall stature that we forgot to actually look at what the reality was. And they finally folded because they knew they could not compete in the poker game against Reagan, upping the missiles and upping the missiles. So they had no money, they had nothing, and they fell apart. So that was a conflict. Luckily, it never turned into a shooting war, although it did, obviously, in Vietnam or Korea back in the 50s. you have to always be prepared. You cannot just assume that the feminine virtues of consensus, which are actually illusory, as we know when we see what large groups of women and how they make their own decisions in their own particular way. There's no perpetual peace. Kant was absolutely right about that.
Mm, mm. So, okay, I'm going to quote you again.
Mm.
In other words, war is not only in our blood, it is our familial birthright and burden. Wish it away though we might, it is the inevitable result of the frictions among human beings and their political extensions, kingdoms, nations, and nation states. No matter how we may pretend it doesn't exist, erase the memory of our martial past, attempt to eradicate it or deny its existence altogether, war or its existential threat is always with us and will be until the day mankind vanishes, which essentially mirrors what you've just said, that you know uh, war will come again. So, Michael, if war is hardwired into our genetic makeup and man's propensity towards bellicosity, such an innate factor of our personality and mindset, if it is such a driver of human potential, why then do we seek to erase man's primal nature from the culture? I mean, other societies have reveled in it, right?
Mm.
The Spartans, the Persians, the Romans, the Vikings. Why is modern man and modern society bent on washing away what it means for men to fight and compete?
That's a really tough and complex question, and obviously I can't answer it in this short time, and nor could I even answer it in one whole book. But
That's a book.
I think we're looking at a unique situation here. Martial virtues are not respected anymore, and in part that's in part because of two things. One is soft-headedness and a feminized culture, because women are not martial. No matter how many movies you see where a 98-pound woman can kick a 275-pound guy through a door, that is not, in fact, true. And I think the fantasy of that is very harmful to both men and women. I think it's been terrible for the armed forces. I think integrating women into combat units, not all units, but combat units,
Hmm.
has been a way to use the guise of fairness and tolerance to reduce our unit effectiveness. And I know that some of the brass, who are mostly political appointees now, will tell you that's not true. But I deal with a lot of military people on the level below brigadier general, shall we say, and
Hmm.
it very much is true with those guys. They know we're feeling that we're fielding an army that's 25% women now, and that army will not do well under combat. Now, the argument is, well, everything's a video game now, and you can sit in Tampa, Florida, and nuke somebody in Kandahar, and so we don't need the natural advantages that men have, strength and uh, just rage. I think women don't quite understand and how important and harnessing rage is. I'm just reading the Iliad right now as kind of a
Mm.
warm up for my next book, rereading it in two different translations. And the first word in the Iliad is rage. That's what it is, rage. Sing, goddess of the rage of of Achilles, and his conflict with Agamemnon. That book, which is the first great work of literature in the Western canon, begins in medias res. The Greeks have been in Troy for 9 years. They're getting nowhere. And now Achilles and Agamemnon have had a big fight over what? Over a woman, of course, not Helen of Troy. There's some slaves that they had grabbed in earlier combat with the Trojans. But
Right.
but they're ready to fight right there. Achilles practically calls him out and says, "Come on down here, tough guy." So this foundational epic is about this rage that young men have, especially young men in their physical primes, and how do we harness it and how do we value it, because when you need it, you're going to need it. You're going to miss it if it's not there. And that is a cold, bald truth that I'm happy to keep articulating as long as I can. It's not an endorsement, but it is a problem. Now, the other problem is that in my previous two books, the Devil's Pleasure Palace and The Fiery Angel. They're more philosophical books. Partly, one of them is devoted to the Frankfurt School of Marxist philosophers that came over in the late 30s and really took over American education. And the leftist progressivism that we're now seeing is its point, and they're very close to articulating it nowadays through BLM and other Antifa, is the destruction of classical Western civilization. Because progressives are all totalitarians at heart. They just use the guise of, their favorite words, diversity, fairness, and tolerance, which they've weaponized. They like a top-down system. There was nothing wrong with the Soviet Union theoretically in their view. They liked the fact that it was run by one guy in the Kremlin who could order his enemies shot the next day if he wanted to. We have to beware these people. When Devil's Pleasure Palace came out, and that was a major success in the intellectual community. It sold extremely well. Members of the Supreme Court read it. It was in the White House. It was in the National Security Council. People understood that the threat is intellectual as well as physical. And in fact, it was used in part for the president's, one of his best speeches, the Warsaw speech, where he talked about the importance of Western civilization. And we're all in this together, you and I and everyone who thinks like we do. We're not the villains. We are the people that are trying to sound the toxin and ring the bell and say, you've got to watch out, because these people, they are not nice people. They pretend to be, but they are not nice people. And right now we're seeing it all over this country very quickly, since they grabbed a hold of all the institutions of government. Even though they're hanging by their fingernails, that makes them crazier in a way. They're in a hurry, and that's why Biden, or the simulacrum of Biden, or the monkey dressed up like Biden, is signing all of those executive orders. They got to get the stuff done. They got to get it fast. And what the left understands that we don't is, once it's institutionalized, it's almost impossible to undo it. So here we still have Obamacare. They rammed it through on Christmas Eve, that second year or first year of the Obama second year of the Obama administration, and we still have it. For all the noise that the alleged conservatives made about it, it's still there, and it's never not going to be there. So that accounts for that. They like. Their ideal form of American government would be if everything was ruled 5-4 by the Supreme Court and they come out on the 5th. That all they need is a one guy. Then I think there's a word for a one guy that rules a country. What is that? Dictatorship, I think so. This is where we're heading. So between the natural feminization and fearfulness and the impolitic of speaking your mind to people, now it's rude. You can't say that. You can't. All I hear about is you can't say that. And my attitude is, so you want to bet? Try me. But we have to be aware of these twin dangers, and I think that's one of my purposes in writing this book.
So in the book, you include Appian of Alexandria's description of the Battle of Mutina in Gaul in 43 BC between troops that were loyal to the Roman Senate, assisted by Octavian, who was the future Emperor Augustus, and those of Mark Antony.
Yeah.
Which is a brutal recount of the nature of hand-to-hand combat and how this type of war has been waged for most of history, including World War I. And I'm going to quote you here. Despite the steady advance of martial technology, things did not materially change for centuries. Even as late as World War I, single combat between soldiers had not entirely disappeared, especially when bayonets were fixed and encounters in no man's land sometimes ended with each man having run the other through fatally. However, Michael, our culture's desire to blot out our savage nature seems to have risen in parallel with the acceleration of our technological prowess and our ability to project power over great distances with machines and advanced weaponry. As you say, sit in Tampa and with a drone, attack Kandahar. It seems that the more automation progresses, the less connected we as humans are to our true nature. And some would say this is a good thing. However, you quote Nietzsche in the book as follows. It is, in fact, and in essence, masculine. No matter how modern man gets, he will never entirely abandon his biological and genetic roots and impulses. So, Michael, where does society's endless push to sanitize man nature and evolve us technologically lead? Because, again, I see this parallel, and I'm curious as to your take on that.
Mm.
Um, you know, the as AI starts to become more integrated with our armed forces, as these decisions come out of the hands of men, a lot of, again, I see it moving in lockstep with the sanitization of, the nature of our being, our propensity towards mano on mano conflict and
Mhm.
settling things the way they need to be settled. Do you see technology undoing us in this way?
Not really. I had a chance to go down to West Point last month and just kind of see what they're up to and have
Okay.
lunch with some of the guys. And they're very heavily invested in what we might call this video game, war game technology.
Hmm.
But they are, from what I saw and understand, keeping that martial spirit alive. That's not to substitute for the fight. That's to train the young soldiers, men and women, reflexes. So what do you do? You're in a forest. So many of the last stands I enumerate in this book are where the side on the short end gets caught with his pants down. Basically, it blunders into a situation. It's in an indefensible place like the Alamo or like the hacienda at Cameron in Mexico when the French Foreign Legion fought the Mexicans. We're trying to train our kids not to get shot that first time out. Get shot a few times virtually, but then be prepared and get back into the field. But still, as you point out, the Battle of Mutina was a very good one. The description that Appian gives us of it is this is a civil war, and later on, of course, Augustus or Octavian and Mark Antony will be on the same side as they fight Brutus and Cassius. But at this point, their legions, they're going against each other, and usually, I find this so moving. The Roman legions tried to scare the bejesus out of their opponents, and they weren't very big. They were Italian, so they were smaller than the Germans were. Towered over them and were much stronger physically, big and hairy and horrible. But the Italians had organization on their side. They wore those big plumes on their head. That was to give them an extra height to make them look bigger. That's all that was. That's wasn't just a cool thing for the movies in the 1950s. Uh, and they made a lot of noise. They would go into battle with trumpets and brr and all this, try to scare the hell out of you. My father recalls that when the Chinese attacked on that night in November, it began with this noise that the Chinese made, gongs and whistles, and it's almost like Chinese New Year, but this ferocious racket. In the Civil War, the Union soldiers tell the first time they heard the rebel yell, it made their blood run cold. It was such an eerie sound. And here's the thing about Mutina that Appian tells us, that the legions went into battle in dead silence. There wasn't a sound to be heard except the grisly work of dispatching the guy in front of you and making sure he didn't dispatch your neighbor and your neighbor taking care of you. So imagine this bloody battle conducted in almost total silence. It's truly an amazing event, and it's a chilling image, I must say.
Yeah. So you see technology is actually assisting us. Automation is actually assisting us, and not necessarily undoing or uh, taking us out. Again, removing us from what is our birthright, and that is to
Right.
wage war when necessary.
I think it augments it, but what we can't have it do is supplant it, because when the EMP device goes off and you have no electricity, and you have foreign troops pouring into your house, it's you and the K-bar knife at that point. So you
Yes,
better
you're
be
right.
ready and to use it and know how to use it.
Fair enough. Okay. Quote: Fighting battles in faraway lands for cultural protection and expansion is not necessarily predatory imperialism or malevolent colonialism, but a hedge against future disaster.
Mhm.
For masculinity is in extremis lethal. Males fight. They fight for both the present and for the future. The enemy who's killing them now in the moment of combat may will fall to one of their sons. To be a male in any century, apparently, but for the 21st, is to be born, if not raised Spartan like, with an understanding that the world is not your friend, but your adversary or your enemy. Historically, nations have recognized this powerful biological fact and have sought to channel it by inducting their young men into the armed forces, whether those of the ancient Greeks or contemporary China. The only culture that doesn't defend itself is one bent on suicide. And so I ask, is the West bent on suicide?
Yes, that's the simple answer. Yes. We've been taught that we're the beasts, the monsters. This has been going on since I was in college. So I went to college in 1967 and
Mhm.
got my first taste of the left in the Vietnam era protests, et cetera. And I remember one of my classmates telling me, I think that white people, and he was talking really about Western civilization, are the freaks and monsters of history. And I thought, what an odd thing to say in 1968 or whatever year it was that we were
Mm.
talking. But we've been told that, now there's whiteness is apparently soon to be outlawed. Uh, e- and we try to reject this by saying, no, Western civilization is open to everybody. But there's almost a tsunami effect now where everything that's, quote, white, unquote, but by which they mean Western civilization, is suspect. And this is critical theory weaponized now. Everything must be questioned and destroyed. And that's what the Frankfurt School brought to America. It's what they certainly brought to Central Europe and France in the postmodernist phase. Uh, we're really up against something that is very difficult for us to fight. So, are we committing suicide? We're being induced into suicide because we don't want to seem toxic or rude or masculine or something. I mean, and every movement now in the culture is to diminish our past, and that's a kind of classic Soviet communist idea. Uh, that just didn't start with the Russians; started with Rousseau and the French Revolution, where they reinvented the calendar. There's always a day one for these apocalyptic millenarian cults, which is what this
Yes.
is. So the French renamed the calendar, for example, and the Soviets kept talking about building the new Soviet man, who would have nothing to do with the old Soviet man, the old un-Soviet man. And they've collapsed because human nature is more indomitable than they have any way of suspecting. But they keep trying, and how much more bloodshed do we have to prove that this is a false notion? Why not just embrace our nature, which mature societies do? Let men and women work it out among themselves without lots of lawyers and HR departments and ad campaigns and all this absolute insanity. I'm a great, less is more in this way. And men and women have been getting along together or not, since Adam and Eve, for crying out loud. Uh, that's never going to change. But we cannot allow them to browbeat us out of existence, or we deserve what we get. Let's put it that way.
So if we're being induced uh, into suicide, um, what do you foresee? Um, so is modern Western society's push to deconstruct masculinity, putting us at risk of, and this is a quote from you, not just dissolving from innovation, right? Um, but facing an end punctuated by conquest.
Mm.
What do you foresee for the West? Do you see us facing an end punctuated by conquest, or do you see us somehow breaking free of this madness?
I don't know. As I learned when I was a young man, if I could foresee the future, I'd go to the track. Because all my buddies taught
Fair
me
enough.
about horse racing when I was in college in New York. I don't know. Is there a way to stop it? It's, for example, I live part time in Ireland, so I'm a part time European Union resident as well.
Mhm.
The European Union, up until recently, it hasn't changed much, was run entirely by childless people. The women were all childless. Theresa May, uh, Madame Potato in Germany. Angela Merkel. I call her Frau Kartoffel. The A couple of gay leaders of the world, and all the men were childless. Everybody was childless. What does it say about a society that's childless? It literally has no stake in the future, none whatsoever. I mean, I have had two children, and I care about them and my grandchildren as well. And so I try to do what I can to make sure that their lives 25, 50 years from now will be as good as they possibly can be. But if I don't have children, then I'm all about myself, and I'm all about, in a way, selfish, entropic selfishness that eventually runs down and stops. And that's where the West has come. I mean, I think there's too much abortion. That hasn't hurt. That just yesterday I read that the U.S. birth rate is now declining. It's at the lowest
Yes.
it's been. Well, this is a result of Roe v. Wade and the constant, how can you bring a child into this world, and blah, 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 and children are anti-Gaia. This is fetishization of nature, which is just insane. But they're taking it out on children now, and a childless society dies. I mean, let's face it, the Chinese are up against this right now. They found out, for guys that are supposed to be good at math, they found out that a one-child society where most of the children are boys ain't going to be around for more than 2 generations. And so what they're trying to do is, first of all, put those men in the army. That's why they have the largest standing army. Not
Right.
because the Chinese can fight. They can't fight. They've lost every war they've ever fought against anybody in the history of everything. This is a really inept military nation, and is now trying to build a navy, and it's never even, learned to swim, for crying out loud. So the China panic makes me laugh. But the fact is, they have to stash those kids somewhere, and they stash them in the People's Liberation Army.
Mm.
We don't have that problem because we don't have kids anymore, and we don't have a draft. So when you wonder, with this notion that all college girls are in danger of being raped right now, they feel that because it's been told to them, and also because the young men have nowhere to channel their sexual energy. And a point I make in Last Dance over and over again is how sexual this is. Custer was one of the most highly sexed people of all time. He got court-martialed for going home to spend some time with his wife because he missed her so much, and he had Indian mistresses and God knows what else. You cannot, you have to harness that energy, but you can't stop it. And Polya would agree with me on this point. It always comes out somewhere, and her attitude is that when you proscribe something, it goes underground and comes out in horrible ways. And her chapter on the Marquis de Sade, I think, in Sexual Persona, is absolutely brilliant, because that's all Sade is I'm sitting here in the Bastille, or later Charenton in the insane asylum, and I'm going to write the most revolting possible fantasies because this is what you're making me do. We have to be aware of that, and you cannot create a perfect world. And I think that's the thing about the Soviets, especially with their dead Lenin, like Jesus lying there, and all the Russians would say, it's really a wax dummy. And I said, well, it sure as hell looks like a wax dummy, and they have to change it all the time. But they create a kind of grotesque parody of Judeo-Christianity, and then they ask us to substitute it for our own faith, and that's crazy. And so the contradiction becomes massive, and here we are. That's cheery. I know that's a cheery answer.
Yeah.
Uh,
Let's talk about some. All right, so let's talk about something a bit more uplifting, like heroism, because in the book you ask a great question. You ask, what is heroism, and what are its moral components? So, I put it to you. What is heroism?
well, I can answer this by when I was talking to my dad about the first night of Chosen, first and second nights, really. I said to him, "Were you ever afraid?" And he looked at me like I was crazy, of course. He said, "You don't have time to be afraid." He said, "At that moment, what you do is you follow your training." And the Marines are very big on this, and a good, well-disciplined army is. As he put it, we went to work. Literally, we went to work. So his attitude at other combat veterans is, if you follow your training, you might get killed. If you don't follow your training, you will get killed. So that's your choice right there. So which one are you going to do, right? Are you going to just follow your training, or are you going to panic and run? And when when people are armies are slaughtered, it's because they turn and run. That
Hmm.
their fear overcomes their discipline. And time and again, you see this in Roman history, certainly. When the Germans broke them at Teutoburg Forest, they ran and they got caught. And the Germans were not pretty when they caught you. They chopped your head off and they nailed it to a tree, among other amusing things that they used to do. So heroism is really a matter of not losing your head. You don't want a hero going into a battle. You want the little nebbishy guy next to you who's scared or a little, but he's focused. And by God, there's a wonderful story that I'm going to tell in the next book. Uh, his name was I think David or Benjamin Solomon. Um, I don't have it in front of me right this minute, but he was a dentist from Milwaukee,
Hmm.
and he wound up in a MASH unit in the Pacific Campaign during World War II. The kid never held a rifle in his life. He was a dentist, but now he's doing triage as the Japanese are overrunning one of the American bases. And this guy, uh, first of all, grabbed a bayonet and bayoneted some Japanese soldiers who had been charging into his tent, his medical tent.
Hmm.
Uh, they overran that. He saw a gunner go down. He ran over to the machine gun next, and when they found his body, 93 dead Japanese soldiers were piled up around it. And then they got him. He was awarded the Medal of Honor, and obviously rightly so. But I think if you said to him, Corporal Solomon or Lieutenant Solomon, are you prepared to be a hero this way? So I'm a dentist. I'm doing my job. He's doing his job. But at that moment, his job included getting on that machine gun and firing until he could fire it anymore. And
Right.
if that's not the purest example of heroism, and he didn't want to be, he's not Achilles for crying out loud, but he was there and he did what he had to do. And I think when you look at the citations for the medals of honor, my father got a Bronze Star at Korea, and you read that citation, you go, well, could I have done that? And then the answer is of course you can, because heroes really are made. They're not born. And when the moment comes to the man has to be a man enough to meet that moment. And I think that's what heroism is.
Mm. Speaking of heroism, this book, Last Stands, is not just about heroism. It's about last stand heroism.
Mm.
Why, Michael, why did you
Yeah.
focus on this particular facet of the heroic narrative?
I don't really know, Lawrence. I just got I got this idea. Has there ever been a book about? I've been fascinated by some last dance, like Custer. I just love the whole Custer story, and
Hmm.
that's the longest chapter in the book, and I think it's the most original. I also, along the way, fell in love with Ulysses S. Grant, who I think is the greatest American who ever lived, ever. And I thought, what does it take when your back's against the wall? What goes through your mind? That was just every writer starts out by asking himself questions, and we do it in the movie business too. So you're Tom Hanks and you live in New Jersey, and Martians land in your backyard. Now what do you do? I mean, so that you set it up with a what if. And then I talked with my friend Victor Davis Hanson after I had developed the whole
Hmm.
idea that it's the greatest military historian that this country has. And he said, "This is a great idea. No one's ever done this before." And we looked, and no one had ever done it before. So I thought, well, there's a commercial opportunity here. So I wrote it, and it was hard. It was very hard. It's a long book. It's 135,000 words, and
Hmm.
all that stuff I had to basically learn from scratch. But somewhere about, shows you how stupid I am. Actually, halfway through the book, I thought, hey, geez, you know what? I have a last stand survivor in my own family, for crying out loud, and one of the most famous battles in Marine Corps history. So I went down to Florida a few years ago, and I sat down and taped his reminiscences, and then the book all came together, and now I'm quite into it. I must say, I'm really looking forward to the new book, which is going to be called, the working title. Do you want to hear the working
Yes,
title?
please.
Working title is A Rage to Live, A Time to Die.
Love it.
So, I mean, yeah, we're ripping off John O'Hara's famous novel, A Rage to Live, and but you can't copyright a title, haha. So, if I could call it the Bible if I wanted to. So that's what it is, and it's about turning point battles. That book has been done before. Edward Creasy did it, and I quote Creasy's book several cases in Last Dance. But I
Hmm.
want to get at the big battles that completely changed the course of history. And I'll just give you an example: Actium, which is a naval battle. My brother, who's a naval officer, retired naval officer, said, "Hey, how come you didn't do any of the naval battles?" Like, I don't care about the Navy. I was joking. Uh, but Actium was a naval battle between the forces of Mark Antony and Cleopatra and Augustus, not quite Augustus yet, Octavian. Uh,
Hmm.
and Octavian won, and Mark Antony and Cleopatra fled back to Egypt, where they committed suicide, and that was the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty. And then Egypt became a Roman province. So that battle changed the entire course of history. Why? Well, because Cleopatra lost her nerve and fled, and Mark Antony loved her so much that he was willing to undergo the humiliation and sure defeat to be with the woman that he loved. That's amazing. On that thread hung Western history. So I've come up with a whole bunch of battles that are similar to that, and it'll be exhausting but fun to get them all down on paper with my little 2 cents observations.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, I think I love the title, and I think that's going to be a fantastic follow up to this book. One last question
Mm.
that I have for you, because we are nearing the end of our time together, and thank
Okay.
you. You've been very generous with your
Oh,
time.
sure.
Um, ki- you know, last stands in and of themselves, they they reek of heroism, right? I mean, it practically leaps off the pages, the stories that you tell. um what what would you say is the cultural significance of last stands in and of themselves?
Mm.
What does it say about the time and the place? What does it say about the moment in history? Um, we don't even understand today a last stand, right? I mean, we can't imagine it.
Right.
Our heads are so filled with distractions. Like you said, when the EMP comes, right, you better you better be ready.
You're going to be
Um,
in one. That's the point. At that point, you're going to be in one.
right.
Yeah.
So what does a last stand say um, about the cultures that have survived them or have not?
Mm. Well, I mentioned a concept that my late friend Jonathan Miller, one of the two geniuses I've ever met, I miss him terribly, the British polymath who was part of the Beyond the Fringe comedy troupe, and was an opera director and a medical doctor. He could do anything. He talked about the afterlife of a work of art. That is, we look at the Venus de Milo, for example, and we don't want her with arms and painted. We like her armless and not painted, because that's what she is to us today. Last stands say at the Alamo, I start off by saying, can a last stand be politically incorrect? Because now the Alamo looks bad, except for the Texans. That chapter has gotten me more abuse from the Texans, who think I didn't. Texas is a weird place. God, I didn't honor them enough. And then I defend Custer, of course, because I think Custer is one of the greatest Americans who ever lived, and I give you 10,000 words why I think so.
Mhm.
That shocked America. That this incredibly famous civil Custer was a celebrity beyond our ability. He was bigger than Cardi B in his time, let me tell you. Uh, and for him to get wiped out, one whole three companies wiped out by Indians, when America was on the verge of the centennial celebration, was a tremendous shock to the national psyche. And it took us a while to get over that. The Alamo, as I say, has changed in feel. Uh, I argue that Shiloh was the last stand, not just for the Confederates, but for the Union, and it was the first major battle in the Civil War. Had Grant lost that battle on day one, and he damn near did, that was the end of Grant. That was the end of Sherman. That was the end of the Union Army. Lincoln is trying to fight that war with, what's his face? I can't even remember. My contempt for him is so great. But Meade and some of the other useless generals that Lincoln had. Um, they're important national things. The Serbs have not got over the Battle of Kosovo, for example, and one of the reasons they fought so hard to keep that, even though Kosovo had been completely Islamicized, was basically a colony of Albania during that war during the Clinton administration, was that they had lost the last stand battle against the Muslims there. and that is a sacred day in Serbian Orthodox Christian history. So they fought like hell for that, and these things animate people hundreds of years later, and we disparage that and diminish it at our own peril, I think.
Yeah, I think it it speaks again to who we are as men, as humans.
Let me give another
Um,
quick example, if I can.
please.
We just celebrated the anniversary of both Masada and the Jewish Warsaw
Right.
Ghetto.
Right.
Both things happened almost at the same time of the year. And to this day, the Israelis swear in some of their forces on the top of Masada, where the Masada rebels, the Maccabees, killed themselves rather than submit to what was going to be horrible torture and death at the hands of the Romans. And
Right.
modern Israel celebrates this, and rightly so. Uh, I think we have these cultural totems that tell us where we came from and who we are. When you start dishonoring your ancestors, you're screwed. That's the end of your culture. You have been defeated, and that's one of the reasons I wrote this book, to remind us of how important these things are.
I think that's a great way to put a cap on this conversation. Um, Michael, it has been fascinating discussing this with you and delving into your ideas and the very concepts that surround your book, Last Stands. Where can our audience learn more about you? Where can they find you? Where can they keep up to date with your writings?
Okay, well, Facebook is the main place on social media. I was an early victim of the Twitter conservative purge. I don't know why they picked me so early, but they did.
Who
I think
knows why? Who?
well, they told me toxic harassment. No, not toxic harassment, toxic masculinity, something like that.
Something like that.
So I'm on Facebook anyway, and I'm very easily found. If you just look for the book cover, you'll see Last Stands, and that's me. There's Michael Walsh is one of the commonest names in Ireland, so there's millions of me. There's priests, there's Canadians, there's Australians, there's all kinds of people. I'm not the Nazi, though. There's a guy who calls himself, it's not even his real name. He calls himself Michael Walsh. He's a Brit, and he writes books in praise of Hitler. So periodically I get dare you.
That's all you need.
It's just what you don't need as a writer. Right. So it's me, not the guy that's in favor of Hitler, on Facebook. And I also edit a new website called thepipeline.org, O-R-G. And it's about what we believe to be the hoax of climate change, the assault on the energy sector, just the Green New Deal, and now, most important this year, the Great Reset, which they're going to use the COVID panic to ram even more totalitarian measures down our throat. So Facebook and the-pipeline.org is where you can find me.
Wonderful. Again, Michael, it's been insightful, and thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thanks very much.